A forgotten tablet holds the key to Skyrim's greatest secret. Elara, a scholar of ancient Nordic history, discovered this fragmented relic, pointing to the dragon priest's hidden archives. She is driven by a deep need to restore her family's academic legacy and reclaim knowledge lost for centuries. Yet she knows this path is dangerous. Disturbing these buried secrets could awaken curses that have slept for ages. By the end of this journey, you will uncover what the dragon priests fought so hard to conceal, and the true price of forbidden knowledge. What happens when a single person decides to unearth a truth meant to stay buried? I would love to know where you are joining this story from and what the sky looks like there tonight. The Arcanium's silence was a heavy cloak, broken only by the soft rustle of parchment. For days, Elara barely moved from a corner desk, the fragmented tablet laid out beside a collection of the college's most restricted journals. She was chasing ghosts in ink, cross-referencing the tablet's angular symbols with faded sketches of temple facades and forgotten burial rites. It was in the crumbling margins of a journal, one attributed to a long-dead explorer, that she found it. The symbols aligned not to form a sentence, but a trail. A subtle, almost invisible map was etched between lines of text, a cartographic secret hidden in plain sight. Her moment of triumph was short-lived. Urag, the old orcish librarian, materialized beside her desk, his presence as solid and imposing as the bookshelves themselves. His voice was a low rumble, meant for her ears alone. He had seen this path walked before, he warned, scholars consumed by the same hunger for the priest's secrets. Some returned with their minds shattered, whispering of stone that breathed and shadows that spoke. Others never returned at all. He spoke not as a threat, but as a weary guardian of knowledge too dangerous to possess. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. Trust his decades of wisdom and abandon the quest, or trust the conviction burning in her own blood. The decision solidified in an instant. This was the key to restoring everything, the very purpose that had driven her this far. Knowledge this profound was worth any peril. Waiting until Urag's back was turned, she carefully, quietly, transcribed the hidden map onto a fresh piece of vellum, her hand steady despite the tremor in her spirit. That single act severed her from the sanctuary of the college. She was no longer just a scholar, but a rogue one, operating outside the bounds of sanctioned study. As she gathered her supplies, a prickling sensation crept up her neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. It was not the simple curiosity of a fellow mage. This gaze felt older, colder, as if the very stones of Winterhold had opened silent, observing eyes. With the copied map safely tucked inside her tunic, Elara stepped out into the biting wind, ready to find the first temple, completely unaware that her search had already found her. The wind screamed down from the high peaks, a relentless force that tried to sculpt Elara into just another icy statue on the mountainside. Her journey to Snowhawk Temple was a brutal contest against the land itself. Each step through the deep, crusted snow was a victory, each gust that threatened to steal her breath a fresh defeat. She navigated by memory and the faint, maddeningly vague lines on her vellum map, avoiding unstable slopes that whispered of avalanches, and twice hiding from the hulking, matted forms of frost trolls whose bellows echoed between the cliffs. Then the storm hit, a white, roaring fury that stole the world. In the blinding chaos, her pack, snagged on a hidden outcrop, tore open, She watched helpless as precious food and a water skin vanished into the swirling abyss. The storm left as suddenly as it arrived, leaving behind a crystal silence and a chilling reality. She was alone with her wits, her map, and a gnawing fear that this was all a fool's errand. What if Snowhawk Temple was just a collapsed pile of stones? What if the dragon priest's archives were nothing more than a poet's metaphor, a legend that had consumed better scholars than her? Her body ached for rest, her mind for certainty, but the memory of that hidden map, of Urag's warning, of her family's faded legacy, was a fire the mountain cold could not extinguish. She pushed onward, driven by a hope that these ruins held not just dust, but the echoes of true power. When the temple's entrance finally emerged from the snowdrifts, a crumbling archway of ancient stone, her heart did not soar with triumph. It clenched with dread. Tracks, recent and sharp-edged, marred the pristine snow before the doorway. They were not the prints of an animal. Someone else was here. The race for knowledge was no longer a solitary pursuit. Taking a steadying breath that crystallized in the air, Elara stepped into the waiting darkness of the archway, the silence within feeling far more threatening than the storm outside. The air inside Snowhawk Temple was thick with the dust of centuries, a dry and ancient scent that filled Elara's lungs with every cautious breath. The grand entrance hall gave way to a narrow, descending corridor, its walls etched with glowing runes that pulsed with a faint, malevolent light. Her academic training screamed at her to stop and document everything, but the instinct for survival was louder. She recognized the pattern from her studies, a classic dragon, priest security system designed to incinerate the unprepared. Each rune was a trigger, and the safe path was a sequence. A silent melody played upon the stones. Placing her feet with painstaking care, she moved in a slow, deliberate dance, her mind reciting half-remembered texts on tonal architecture. One misstep, one misplaced breath, and the corridor would become her tomb. She reached the end, heart pounding with relief, and leaned against what she thought was a solid wall to steady herself. A deep, resonant click echoed through the passage, and with a groan of shifting stone, a massive slab slid down, sealing the entrance behind her in total darkness. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. The walls seemed to press in, the weight of the entire mountain now feeling like a physical force. She was trapped. Her breathing came in short, ragged gasps as she fought the primal fear of being buried alive. But giving in to terror would mean joining the other lost scholars Urag had spoken of. Forcing air deep into her lungs, she focused on the only path left, forward. The archives were her goal, and a repository of such power would never have only one exit. It was a desperate hope, but it was all she had. Deeper into the temple she pressed, the glow of her mage light casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. Then she heard it, a sound that froze the blood in her veins, the dry, scraping rustle of ancient limbs stirring from their slumber. From the side chambers she had passed, the Draugr were awakening, their blue eyes igniting in the gloom, one by one. Their footsteps, slow and shuffling at first, began to echo with gathering purpose. Elara broke into a run, her boots echoing on the stone floor as she raced toward a soft, golden glow emanating from a chamber at the end of the hall, praying it held not just answers, but a way out. The chamber opened into a breathtaking cavern of knowledge. Stone tablets lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their surfaces alive with intricate, glowing script. But it was the center of the room that stole Elara's breath. Enchanted crystals, each the size of a human skull, floated in a slow, silent orbit, and as they turned, they cast shimmering, three-dimensional images into the air. Here were the dragon priests not as skeletal guardians, but as living, powerful figures, their arms raised as they performed complex rituals for an audience of silent, massive dragons. The air hummed with preserved power, a low thrum that vibrated in her very bones. Drawn to the nearest crystal, she reached out, her fingers brushing its cool, smooth surface. A jolt of energy shot up her arm, and a torrent of visions flooded her mind, 1,000 voices speaking in a long dead tongue. But with the knowledge came a searing, psychic backlash. A warning, ancient and absolute, seared itself into her consciousness. This archive was not merely hidden, it was guarded by a curse designed to scour the minds of the unworthy, to leave them empty shells, forever forgetting what they had sought to learn. The pressure built behind her eyes, a white-hot pain, threatening to unravel her very thoughts. She had to focus. Amid the chaotic stream of information, one ritual shone with particular clarity, a series of precise movements and chants, meant to bend the power of a dragon's shout, to turn its own voice against it. This was the key, a fragment of power she could not afford to lose. Gritting her teeth against the mental onslaught, she forced her mind to cling to that single thread of knowledge, repeating the patterns internally, etching them into her memory, even as the curse tried to wash them away. She could feel it working, feel gaps appearing in her recent thoughts. What was the third step of the ritual she had just seen? The name of the priest, demonstrating it, flickered and vanished from her mind. The memory lapses were fleeting but terrifying, proof that the curse was already claiming pieces of her. In a moment of crystalline panic, she realized the shuffling footsteps she had been hearing were not just echoes of her own frantic heartbeat. A shadow detached itself from behind a towering cluster of crystals, a figure clad in dark, tattered robes that smelled of cold earth and old magic. It was another seeker, drawn by the same power, and its hollow eyes were fixed not on her, but on the crystal she guarded. There was no time for questions, no room for negotiation. As the figure lunged, a rusted dagger gleaming in the crystal light, Elara's hand went to the iron dagger at her own belt, her mind still desperately clinging to the fading echoes of a dragon's silenced roar. The rusted dagger sliced through the air where Elara's throat had been a moment before. She stumbled back, her own iron blade held in a white-knuckled grip. The figure, a man with a gaunt face and fever-bright eyes, was clad in the tattered remnants of a college robe, now stained with dirt and something darker. He did not press his attack immediately, instead circling her like a wolf, his gaze darting between her and the pulsating crystal. "You are the scholar from Winterhold," he rasped, his voice raw. "I felt the wards break when you entered. I am Kale, and you have found what belongs to me." He saw the archives not as a sacred trust, but as a weapon to be seized, a means to command the power that once ruled Skyrim. Elara's mind raced, the curse still whispering at the edges of her thoughts, threatening to steal the ritual she had just memorized. Fighting him directly was a terrible risk. His desperation radiated from him like heat, and a desperate mage was the most unpredictable and dangerous kind. Yet, handing over this knowledge, felt like a betrayal of everything she had risked. There had to be another way. I did not come to hoard this, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I came to understand it, but this place it is fighting back. It is stealing my memories even now. You felt it too, didn't you? Kale's eyes narrowed, a flicker of unease betraying his furious certainty. She pressed her advantage, a dangerous gamble forming in her mind. Help me navigate the deeper curses. Help me preserve what we find, and I will share the knowledge with you. All of it. The silence that followed was heavier than the mountain above them. Kale's gaze was a physical weight, calculating her worth, her truthfulness. He needed her, she realized. He had followed her here because he could not decipher the path on his own. A grim, reluctant acceptance settled on his features. Very well, scholar, a temporary alliance. But if you cross me, your fate will be far kinder than what I will do. The agreement was a fragile thread, and Elara felt its inevitable snap in the cold air between them. He would betray her the moment he had what he wanted. For now, she had bought time and a dangerous pair of eyes to watch for traps she might miss. They turned from the crystal chamber, moving deeper into the archives. Their footsteps echoed in unison, a hollow rhythm that could not disguise the silent war of intentions. Elara planned how to use the knowledge she had already secured, while Kale's hungry eyes scanned the halls, already measuring her for a grave. The corridor ended not in another chamber, but in a solid wall of polished obsidian, seamless except for a single, massive circular door. Its surface was a masterwork of ancient engineering, divided into 8 segments, each bearing a deep, mask-shaped indentation. Above them, a series of flowing glyphs glowed with a soft, ominous light. Kale immediately stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward the stone. Elara grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Wait, this is not a lock to be forced. It is a test. Look, she pointed to the glyphs, her mind already sorting through the fragmented histories she had studied. These are not instructions, they are warnings. Each mask corresponds to a specific priest, a specific domain of power. Placing them in the wrong order will not simply deny us entry. It will bury us, Kale scoffed, gesturing impatiently at the empty slots. We do not have 8 masks, scholar. This is a dead end. But Elara was already tracing the symbols with her eyes. We do not need the physical masks. We need to understand their hierarchy, their relationship to the elements and the calendar. The solution is symbolic. She began to speak, her voice low and focused, assigning names to the slots. Morokai, the glimmering one, linked to the element of shock. He would be placed here, opposite the rune for shattered stone. Kale argued for a different configuration, one based on raw power he had read about in a dubious text, a sequence that prioritized domination. His way was faster, more aggressive. It was also, Elara was certain, catastrophically wrong. Trust my research, or we die here, she stated, her tone leaving no room for debate. With a frustrated growl, he relented, watching as she mentally slotted the spectral masks into their rightful places. As she whispered the final alignment, a deep thrum resonated through the floor. The massive door split along its segments, each one retracting silently into the wall, revealing a passage into profound darkness. Their victory was short-lived. The moment the door fully opened, the glyphs above it flared into a blinding white light. From that radiance, a form began to coalesce, pulling the very light and dust from the air to construct a towering, spectral figure clad in the ornate robes and fearsome mask of a dragon priest. It did not speak. It simply turned its hollow gaze upon them, one hand raising, a vortex of blue-white energy already swirling into existence around its fingers. The alliance of convenience shattered in that single, silent moment. Kale stumbled back, his own magic flaring to life in a defensive ward. Elara drew her dagger, the forgotten ritual she had memorized screaming in her mind, a desperate, untested defense against a power that had not walked the world for millennia. They were no longer rivals searching for knowledge. They were prey, and the hunter had just awakened. The spectral guardian's attack was not a spell, but an unraveling of the air itself. A torrent of freezing energy slammed into Kale's hastily conjured ward, shattering it into 1,000 shimmering fragments and throwing him back against the obsidian door with a sickening crack. He crumpled, his cry of pain swallowed by the guardian's silent, advancing presence. Elara's mind, still frayed by the archive's curse, snapped into a terrible clarity. She could run. The passage behind them was clear. Leaving him was the logical choice, the survivalist's creed. He would have done the same for her, but the scholar in her, the one who valued knowledge and life over petty vengeance, recoiled at the idea. His research, however flawed, could still be a piece of the larger puzzle, and she was not yet so corrupted by this place that she would leave a wounded man to be unmade by a phantom. He is a liability, a voice of cold reason whispered in her mind. He will get you killed. She ignored it. As the guardian raised its hands again, the air chilling with gathering power, Elara did not attack it. Instead, she focused her will on one of the floating archive crystals they had passed. With a sharp telekinetic shove, she sent it careening into a cluster of its brethren. The impact was spectacular. Light erupted through the chamber, a deafening chorus of shattering crystal and cascading, broken magic. The guardian, its form flickering violently, turned its masked face toward the source of the disruption. It was the only opening they would get. Elara sprinted to Kale's side, hauling his arm over her shoulder. "Get up," she grunted, her muscles screaming in protest as she dragged him to his feet. He was heavy, his breath coming in ragged, pained gasps. They staggered from the inner sanctum, just as the ceiling behind them began to groan, great stone blocks shifting and crashing down, sealing the guardian and its cursed knowledge behind a wall of rubble. The temple was coming apart around them, the ancient wards failing. Their flight back through the rune-lit corridors was a blur of falling dust and deafening noise, Elara half carrying, half dragging Kale as he stumbled alongside her. They burst out into the blinding white of the mountainside, just as the entrance archway collapsed in a final, thunderous roar, sending a plume of snow and ancient stone into the sky. They stood there, panting in the sudden, frigid silence, the temple now a tomb behind them. Elara's hand went to the inner pocket of her tunic, her heart sinking. The vellum map she had so carefully copied was there, but dampened and torn from their frantic escape, some of its delicate lines now blurred into illegibility. Kale leaned against a rock, clutching his injured side, his eyes burning with a mixture of pain and fury. "You should have left me," he rasped. "This changes nothing. I will find the other archives. I do not need you or your fragile morals." With a final hateful glance, He turned and began a slow, limping descent down the mountain, leaving her alone with the wind and her damaged prize. As the sun dipped below the peaks, casting long blue shadows, Elara found shelter in a shallow cave. With trembling hands, she smoothed the torn vellum on a flat stone. The loss was significant, but not total. As she studied the smudged lines under the faint light of a magica flame, new patterns emerged. The damage had obscured the path to Snowhawk, but in doing so, it highlighted other, subtler markings she had missed before. One symbol, a stylized dragon coiled around a mountain peak, stood out with new clarity. It matched descriptions in the college's oldest journals. It was Forelhost, the most heavily fortified and notoriously deadly of all the dragon priest strongholds. The path forward was not lost. It had simply become far more treacherous. The journey to Forelhost was a lesson in endurance. Elara kept to the high, treacherous paths of the Draugr Mountains, her body a map of new aches and old bruises. She moved like a shadow, her senses strained to their limits to avoid the bandit patrols that claimed these slopes. Their crude camps were easy to spot, marked by the smoke of cook fires and the harsh sounds of laughter that carried on the thin air. Each detour cost her time and energy, and by the time the fortress temple came into view, she was running on little more than sheer will. Forelhost was not like Snowhawk. It was not a temple hidden by snow, but a fortress carved defiantly into the mountain's very face, its walls black and imposing against the gray stone. It looked less like a place of knowledge and more like a declaration of war, a bastion built to withstand sieges for eternity. The main gate was a colossal structure of iron and stone, scarred by ancient assaults, and clearly still watched by things that did not sleep. Approaching it directly would be a swift death. Her fingers traced the damaged vellum in her pocket, her mind clinging to the one clear symbol that had survived the escape from Snowhawk, a coiled dragon around a peak. It was paired in her notes with a fragment of text from a salvaged journal, a mention of the Zephyr Passage, a forgotten conduit used by the priests for swift, unseen travel. It was not on any modern map. Finding it meant trusting the land itself, reading the lay of the stone for a seam that should not exist. After hours of searching a windswept cliff face, she found it, a narrow fissure, almost completely obscured by a petrified tree, its roots gripping the rock like skeletal fingers. The air that whispered from the opening was stale and carried the faint, metallic scent of ozone. This was her way in. Slipping through the tight passage, she entered a world of profound silence. The air within Forelhost was heavy, thick with a palpable sense of vigilance. Unlike the dormant stillness of Snowhawk, this place felt awake. The glow of magical wards pulsed at every major corridor intersection, and the soft, shuffling footsteps of Draugr sentinels echoed in a regular, patrol-like rhythm from the levels above. These archives were not just hidden, they were actively protected, their secrets deemed too vital to be left to chance. Elara moved with the silence of a falling leaf, her every sense screaming at her to retreat. But as she pressed deeper into the labyrinthine halls, a new sound began to bleed into the silence, one that rooted her to the spot. It was a low, resonant chanting, a chorus of dry, ancient voices speaking in unison. The rhythm was hypnotic and deeply unsettling, a clear sign that somewhere in the heart of this dead fortress, a ritual was already in progress. The chanting grew into a palpable force, a rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the stone beneath Elara's feet. She followed the sound to a vast, circular chamber, its architecture open and tiered like a nightmarish amphitheater. Below, a circle of Draugr stood motionless, their desiccated throats producing the low, resonant chorus. Their collective will was channeled toward a central altar, upon which hovered a single, pulsing orb of pure magicka. This was no mere ceremony, it was an engine, a continuous ritual sustaining the very wards and traps that guarded Forelhost's deepest secrets. To interrupt it would be like pulling the keystone from an arch. The entire fortress could come crashing down, or worse, release whatever entity was being kept in check by that focused energy. Her goal, the archives, lay in a sealed alcove directly behind the ritual chamber, inaccessible as long as the Draugr maintained their vigil. A direct assault was suicide, but waiting for a lapse that would never come was a slow defeat. Her mind raced, discarding one reckless plan after another. Then she remembered the unstable geology of the mountain, the groaning ceiling of Snowhawk. She would not attack the ritual, she would redirect its guardians. Retracing her steps to a narrower passage she had just passed, Elara focused her remaining magicka on a single, cracked support pillar. With a sharp, concussive burst of force, she struck it. The sound was a thunderclap in the confined space. Stone groaned, dust rained down, and a section of the corridor collapsed in a roar of falling rock. For a heart-stopping moment, the chanting faltered. Then, as she had hoped, a dozen of the Draugr broke from the circle, their blue eyes swiveling toward the source of the disturbance, shuffling away to investigate the perceived threat to their domain. It was a partial victory. The ritual continued, weakened but unbroken, as the remaining Draugr chanted on, but the diversion had worked just enough. As the investigating Draugr moved past her hiding spot, Elara slipped from the shadows and darted into the now less guarded ritual chamber. She moved not toward the central orb, but along the periphery, heading for the sealed alcove. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each footfall sounding deafeningly loud. She was almost there when a gauntleted hand shot out, grabbing her arm with bone-crushing force. One of the chanting Draugr had broken rank, its hollow eyes fixed on her with ancient hatred. It raised its ancient sword, a rusty blur in the pulsating light. Elara twisted, her free hand fumbling for her iron dagger, knowing she was too slow. The killing blow never fell. From a dark archway to her left, a crossbow bolt hissed through the air, striking the Draugr square in its temple. The creature stiffened, its grip loosening, and crumpled into a pile of bone and rusted armor. Stunned, Elara looked toward the archway. A figure emerged, lowering a heavy crossbow. It was a woman, clad in practical, worn leathers, her face sharp and weathered, framed by a practical braid. She gestured urgently toward the alcove. "This way, now, before the others return," she said, her voice a low, no-nonsense whisper. With the Draugr momentarily distracted by both the cave-in and their fallen comrade, Elara did not hesitate. She followed the stranger through the archway and into a small, hidden annex, the stone door sliding shut behind them, muting the relentless chant. The air in the annex was still and cold, and lining its walls were more of the familiar stone tablets, the second set of archives. But Elara's attention was fixed on the woman who had just saved her life, a fellow seeker in this tomb of stone and magic, whose motives were as yet completely unknown. The silence in the annex was a fragile thing, broken only by the soft hum of ancient stone. Before Elara could voice her thanks to the stranger, the air before her shimmered, and a new form coalesced from the motes of dust and magicka. It was the ghost of an old Mer, his form translucent, his eyes holding a deep, weary sadness. He was not a threat, but a guardian, the last echo of a scholar named Lorkalin, who had died centuries ago, trying to seal these archives away from a world not ready for their burden. His voice was like the whisper of turning pages. You risk much to come here, child. The secrets of Forelhost are not of domination, like those you faced in Snowhawk. They are of time itself. To hold this knowledge is to hold a thread of the tapestry of existence, a power that can unravel destinies if misused. He studied her, his gaze piercing through to her very soul. Why have you come? Prove to me you are not merely another thief in the night, hungry for a power you cannot comprehend. Elara felt the weight of the question. She could have spoken of academic glory or personal ambition, but under that spectral gaze, only the truth remained. She told him of her family, of generations of scholars whose work had been lost to fire and envy, their legacy reduced to whispers. She spoke not of reclaiming power, but of restoring context, of ensuring that such profound understanding was preserved with the reverence it deserved, not wielded as a weapon. She recounted her decision to spare Kale and Snowhawk, an act that had nearly cost her everything. It was not a story of strength, but one of flawed, human choice. A long silence followed. The spirit, Lorkalin, slowly nodded, a gesture of profound relief. I have waited an age to hear such an intention. The others who found this place sought to bend time to their will, to rewrite their failures or claim eternal life. You seek only to remember, for that I will guide you, but his expression grew grim. Your mercy in the mountains has bought you a rival, not an ally. The one called Kale found another path in. He is already within the inner sanctum, driven by a feverish need to undo a past tragedy. He believes the power here can restore a life long lost. He is wrong. The archives cannot resurrect the dead, only fracture the timeline, creating echoes and paradoxes that would consume him and this world. You must stop him. The confrontation you have dreaded is now upon you. With those chilling words, the spirit gestured toward a section of the wall that shimmered and became insubstantial, revealing a hidden staircase, spiraling down into the mountain's heart. Trusting the ghost who had seen her soul, Elara stepped forward, the air growing colder with each step, the hum of raw, temporal power vibrating in her teeth. She was walking not just toward a final archive, but toward a man who wanted to rewrite history itself, and she was the only thread holding the present together. The inner sanctum was a cavern of frozen time. Crystals, far larger and more complex than those in Snowhawk, floated in a silent, graceful dance. They did not show the past as static images, but as living, breathing moments that one could almost step into. Elara approached one, her reflection distorted on its multifaceted surface. Tentatively, she placed a hand upon it. The world dissolved. She was no longer in the temple. She stood on a hill, overlooking a burning whiterun, the air thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. At the center of the carnage stood Kale, but he was a twisted version of the desperate man she knew. His eyes glowed with malevolent power, a dragon priest's mask fused to his face, and in his raised hand he wielded a staff that pulsed with the stolen energy of the time stream itself. This was not a potential future. It was an inevitability, the direct consequence of a broken man trying to mend his past with a power that could only shatter the present. The vision vanished, leaving her gasping in the cold sanctum, her resolve hardening into something cold and unyielding. She had to stop him. The temptation to use the archives herself was a venomous whisper. She could see her family's legacy restored, their names carved in gold, their lost works returned to the world, but the cost was written in the ashes of that vision. To change one thread was to unravel the entire tapestry. Her purpose had to be preservation, not intervention. She would document what she saw, transcribing the rituals and warnings onto her remaining vellum, creating a record that could be studied, not a weapon to be wielded. She had just begun to sketch the first crystal's alignment when a voice, ragged with obsession, cut through the silence. "I told you I would find it." Kale emerged from a shadowed archway, his form flickering unnaturally, as if he were not entirely in the same moment as her. His eyes were fixed on the largest crystal, a pulsating heart of amethyst light. "You cannot stop me, Elara. I have seen what I will do." Elara stood her ground, her voice firm. "What you saw is a lie, Kale. It is the archives showing you your own corruption, not your triumph. It is a warning." He laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "It is my destiny." He lunged past her, his hands slamming against the central crystal. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The air screamed. The sanctum fractured, not in stone, but in reality itself. Portals of shimmering energy ripped open, showing glimpses of impossible landscapes, of Skyrims that never were and might never be. A blast of temporal energy threw Elara backward, her documentation scattering across the floor. She watched in horror as Kale began to be pulled into one of the rifts, his form stretching and distorting. To let him be consumed would solve her problem, but it would leave the archives unstable, a wound in time that could bleed into the world forever. She had to stabilize the core, to reverse the cascade he had initiated, even if it meant saving the man who had become her enemy. The very fabric of the world was tearing at the seams, and she was the only one who could stitch it back together. The air itself was screaming, a high-pitched whine of reality tearing apart. Kale was a silhouette of agony, his form flickering between the present and a dozen impossible futures, his hand still fused to the central crystal by a torrent of violet energy. He was not controlling the power, he was being consumed by it, his desperate wish to rewrite history, creating a feedback loop that was now devouring the archive. Elara did not attack him. Instead, she focused on the source, her mind racing through the ritual she had memorized in Snowhawk. It was a counterspell, a way to silence a dragon's voice. This temporal storm was a shout against time itself. She began the precise movements, her hands tracing patterns in the chaotic air, her voice a low, steady chant against the deafening roar. The reaction was immediate and violent. The crystal Kale was touching flared with blinding light, then shattered into a million glittering shards. The blast threw him clear, his body slamming against a stone plinth with a sickening crunch. The time rifts wavered, their edges fraying like torn cloth. One moment, a portal showed a Skyrim overgrown with glowing fungi. The next, it collapsed in on itself with a sound like a dying breath. The archives were failing. Kale lay broken and still, his breathing shallow. A collapsing rift swirled dangerously close to his unconscious form, a window into a barren, ash-choked wasteland. To leave him was the simplest choice. He had caused this. He would face the consequence of his greed, erased from time as he had sought to master it. But Elara saw the scorched notes scattered around him, sketches of a woman's face. He was a fool, but he was a man broken by loss, not pure evil. Her family's legacy was about preserving knowledge, and that included the hard lesson of his failure. She lunged forward, grabbing the collar of his robe and hauling him back just as the rift snapped shut, severing a lock of his hair that vanished into nothingness. The entire chamber groaned, great cracks racing up the walls. There was no time for gratitude or recrimination. The mountain was coming down. She dragged Kale, half-conscious and moaning, through the crumbling sanctum, past falling stone and dying magical light. Their escape was a desperate scramble through shaking corridors. The ancient fortress of Forelhost, determined to bury its secrets and them with it. They burst out onto a narrow ledge high on the mountain's side, as the entrance behind them sealed forever under a cascade of rock and dust. They stood in the biting wind, the only sound their ragged breaths and the settling rumble of the tomb. Kale sank to his knees, clutching his injured side, his obsession extinguished, replaced by a hollow, weary shame. He looked at Elara, his voice barely a whisper. "You should have let the rift take me. After all I did." Her own body ached with exhaustion, but her resolve was clear. Knowledge claimed with blood is a poison, Kale. It corrupts everything it touches. I will not let that be my legacy. He was silent for a long moment, the wind whipping at his tattered robes. Then he spoke, his words heavy with a newfound gravity. "There is a third temple, one the maps do not name. The priests called it the Vault of Echoes, a place where they did not store power or rituals, but a single, final secret. It is not built of stone, but of memory itself." He met her eyes, his gaze now clear and deadly serious. "You seek to preserve knowledge. That is where your path ends. But be warned, scholar, to enter the Vault of Echoes is to be judged by all you have learned. Few who seek it return whole." With that, he turned and began his slow, limping descent, leaving Elara alone with the wind and a destination more terrifying than any fortress. The name Skuldafn echoed in Elara's mind, a final, chilling piece of the puzzle. Kale's fragmented warning and her own cross-reference research pointed to a single, terrifying conclusion. This was not a temple buried in rock, but one suspended in the sky, a fortress built upon a peak, so high it pierced the clouds. The ancient texts were unequivocal. Skuldafn was accessible only by air, a sanctuary for dragons and the seat of power for their most devoted priests. The very air around it was said to be thick with ancient magics, a ward against any mortal who dared approach on foot. For a scholar with no wings, the path seemed utterly closed, a final, mocking barrier to the truth. Yet, in the oldest Nordic sagas, she found a sliver of hope. The ancient tongues, the heroes who wielded the voice as a weapon, did not fly. They climbed. They navigated the impossible spines of the world using paths known only to them, routes etched not on maps, but in the stories of their conquests. Her only chance lay in finding someone who still remembered those stories. Her search led her to a secluded hunter's lodge at the foot of the Velothi Mountains, home to a woman named Runna, a legend whispered about in the mead halls. Rana was a retired dragon hunter, her body a tapestry of scars and her eyes holding the sharp, patient focus of a hawk. She listened to Elara's plea in silence, her gaze lingering on the scholar's worn hands and determined face. After a long pause, she agreed to guide her, but her terms were a warning in themselves. She knew of a path, a treacherous series of narrow ledges and crumbling handholds, known as the Stair of the Sun. It was a brutal, day-long climb that would test the limits of Elara's endurance, and at the summit, Rana cautioned they would not find ruins, they would find a warden. The guardian of Skuldafn was not a Draugr or a spectral echo, but a dragon priest who had never surrendered to death, a being of immense power who had watched over the temple's ultimate secret for millennia. With a seasoned but grim ally at her side, Elara looked up at the distant, cloud-wreathed peak. This was no longer an academic quest. It was a direct challenge to a living god, and the final test would demand more from her than just knowledge. It would require the heart of a dragon slayer. The Stair of the Sun was a scar upon the mountain's face, a crumbling promise of a path that seemed to vanish into the clouds. Elara's world narrowed to the feel of cold granite under her fingertips and the dizzying drop just beyond her boots. Rana moved with a predator's grace ahead of her, finding holds invisible to Elara's scholarly eyes. They moved in tense silence, their progress measured in agonizing inches. The only sounds were the scuff of leather on stone and the distant, haunting calls of dragons circling the peaks like living storm clouds. One wrong move, one dislodged pebble, would be a beacon to those winged sentinels. Elara's muscles screamed in protest, her mind a battleground between academic focus and raw, primal fear. She focused on the rhythm of the climb, on matching Rana's precise movements, forcing the vertigo down with each measured breath. They were halfway up a particularly sheer section when the mountain itself seemed to rebel. A shelf of rock, weakened by centuries of ice, gave way without warning. Rana, testing the next handhold, was directly below the cascade. She tried to twist away, but a basketball-sized chunk of stone slammed into her shoulder, sending her swinging violently on her rope. Elara watched in horror, anchored to the cliff face, utterly helpless as the hunter gritted her teeth against a cry of pain. The rock slide continued for a few more seconds, a thunderous roar that felt like it would shake them from the wall before settling into an ominous quiet. When the dust cleared, Rana was clinging to her line, her left arm hanging uselessly at her side. Her face was pale, but her voice was iron. "The climb is over for me," she stated, her gaze fixed on the summit still hundreds of feet above. "You have to go on alone. The path from here is a straight shot, but the most exposed. You can make it." Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. The thought of continuing without the hunter's strength and experience was a fresh wave of terror. Every instinct told her to retreat, to help Rana back down to safety. But looking into the hunter's resolute eyes, she saw not a plea for help, but a challenge. To turn back now would render the entire perilous journey meaningless. Nodding, her throat too tight for words, Elara transferred what supplies she could to her own pack. She left Rana secured in a small crevice with food and water, a silent promise to return. Then she turned her face to the summit and began the final, solitary ascent. The wind howled around her, a lonely voice that mirrored the isolation in her soul. She fought the tremble in her limbs, focusing on each new handhold, each careful placement of her boot. She used her ropes and pittons not with a climber's skill, but with a desperate, determined logic, inching her way upward. When her raw fingers finally closed over the solid, level edge of the summit, she hauled herself over, collapsing onto flat stone, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The sight that greeted her stole what little breath she had left. Skuldafn was not a ruin. It was a monument of terrifying grandeur, its architecture both majestic and alien, its central tower piercing the sky. The air thrummed with a deep, resonant power that was both exhilarating and suffocating. It was in that moment of awe that a shadow fell over her. A dragon, its scales the color of aged bone, circled the central tower once before turning its horned head directly toward her. It did not need to see her. It felt her. A deep, guttural roar erupted from its throat, a sound that was not merely noise, but a physical force that vibrated through the stone beneath her and shook the very air she breathed. Her presence was no longer a secret. Taking a deep breath, Elara pushed herself to her feet, her legs feeling like water. She stepped past the crumbling outer wall and onto the temple grounds, the ancient stones seeming to watch her every move. She was utterly alone, but the final archive was within reach, and she was ready to face whatever guardians awaited. The silence inside Skuldafn was a physical presence, thick and watchful. Elara moved through grand, empty halls where dust motes danced in beams of cold light, her footsteps echoing a solitary rhythm against stone. The architecture was a puzzle in itself, with corridors that spiraled into dead ends and stairways that led back to their own starting point. It was a labyrinth designed not to confuse, but to test. She encountered no Draugr, no spectral guardians. The only obstacles were the temple's own bones, shifting and changing in response to her presence. A doorway would seal itself until she traced the correct sequence of runes on a nearby plinth, their meaning unlocked by a fragment of lore she recalled from Forelhost. A bridge of light would only solidify when she stood on a specific pressure plate and whispered the name of a long-dead dragon, a name she had found scrawled in the margin of her own tattered notes. This was not a defense of stone and magic, but an examination of mind and memory. The final chamber was not hidden behind a door, but revealed when she solved the last riddle. It was a circular room, its walls made of a substance that was neither stone nor crystal, but something that seemed to breathe with a soft inner light. In the center stood a single, flawless obelisk. As she approached, a voice resonated not in the air, but directly within her mind. It was ancient, vast, and collective. You have walked far, child of a fleeting age. You have faced the storms of greed and the precipice of time. But why do you seek us? Speak your truth to the memory of the world. This was the sentient heart of the archives, the collective consciousness of all the knowledge she had pursued. It was not a thing to be taken, but a being that would choose its inheritor. Elara stood before the obelisk, her journey laid bare. She did not speak of glory or legacy. She spoke of the scorched notes in Snowhawk, of the hollow shame in Kale's eyes, of the weight of a future she refused to corrupt. I sought to preserve what was lost, she said, her voice clear in the profound silence, not to claim power, but to understand the responsibility that comes with it. I have seen knowledge used as a weapon and as a cure. I choose the cure. A warmth emanated from the obelisk, and the breathing walls pulsed with a gentle, golden light. The voice spoke again, this time with a tone of approval. Then see, Preserver, see the purpose you have honored. A vision flooded her senses. She saw the dragon priests not as tyrannical sorcerers, but as stewards. They stood at the nexus of immense magical ley lines, their rituals not commands, but conversations with the land itself. They soothed volcanic anger, guided the growth of forests, and balanced the very weather, acting as a crucial buffer between the raw, untamed power of the world and the fragile civilizations that lived upon it. Their goal was never domination, but a sacred, precarious equilibrium. The vision faded, leaving Elara with a profound and humbling understanding. The true secret was not a spell of ultimate power, but a lesson in harmony. As the last echoes of the vision receded from her mind, a new sound reached her ears, sharp and immediate in the hallowed silence. The distinct, metallic click of armored footsteps approaching from the corridor outside. The metallic footsteps halted at the chamber's entrance. Elara turned, expecting another spectral warden, or perhaps a Draugr sentinel, but the figure that stood there was woven from pure light and shadow. It wore the ornate mask of a dragon priest, yet its form was translucent, a being of concentrated will rather than flesh. It did not raise a hand to attack. Instead, a voice resonated within her mind, calm and ancient. You have passed the tests of the temple, but the final trial is not of the body, it is of the spirit. State your purpose, seeker. For what end do you wish to possess the world's oldest truth? This was not a fight she could win with a dagger or a clever spell. Her very intentions were the battlefield. She answered with the truth she had earned, to preserve it, to learn from the failures of the past, so they are not repeated. The Guardian's presence pressed in on her, a weightless, immense pressure, a noble goal, but preservation is a form of control. Who are you to decide what knowledge is saved and what is lost? What if your preservation leads to another's destruction? Imagine a plague cure locked away to prevent its misuse, while millions die. Is that wisdom or arrogance? Elara felt the trap in the question, a philosophical snare designed to unravel certainty. She thought of Kale's scorched notes, of Urag's warnings in the Arcaneum. I cannot control what others do with knowledge, she responded, her mental voice firm, but I can choose not to hand a lit torch to a man standing in a library. The purpose of knowledge is to illuminate, not to burn. The Guardian shifted, its spectral robes flowing like mist, and if illuminating one shadow creates a dozen more. The priests sought balance, and still, their legacy is one of ruin in the eyes of your kind. Her answer came not from academic theory, but from the weary conviction forged in the mountains. Then the work is never finished. A steward does not abandon the field after one storm. They mend the wall and continue the watch. Knowledge is no different. It requires perpetual guardians, not eternal locks. A long silence filled the chamber, the very air seeming to hold its breath. Then, the Guardian gave a slow, acknowledging nod. You understand the burden. You may pass, but know this, the trial of thought is over. The trial of force now approaches. As the spectral form began to dissolve into motes of light, it gestured toward the corridor. Your rival has not your wisdom. He comes with a key that should have been lost, and he intends to break the lock. The moment the Guardian vanished, a thunderous crash echoed from the hallway, followed by the screech of rending stone. Elara turned from the now unguarded core archives to see Kale standing in the shattered doorway, but he was transformed. His eyes blazed with a frantic energy, and in his hands, he clutched a staff of twisted, dark metal, its head cradling a pulsating red gem that drank the light from the room. He had not come to be tested. He had come to take what he wanted. The staff in Kale's hands pulsed with a malevolent red light, its energy warping the very air around it. "Give me the core," he demanded, his voice a ragged echo of the man she had once known. His eyes were fixed on the glowing obelisk behind her, seeing not wisdom, but a lever to rewrite his personal tragedy. Elara stood her ground, her own hands empty. "I will not let you use this knowledge to break the world." His answer was a roar of raw, destructive magic. A wave of concussive force slammed into her, throwing her back against the chamber wall. The impact stole her breath, but she rolled aside as a second blast scorched the stone where she had fallen. This was not a duel of spells, but a demolition. Kale was not aiming for her. He was trying to collapse the chamber, to shatter the archives and seize the core in the ensuing chaos. He swung the staff like a battering ram, and a crack of crimson energy shot toward a floating crystal. Elara did not try to counter it with her own weak magic. Instead, she focused on the temple itself, on the defensive mechanisms she had just spent hours navigating. As the bolt of energy flew, she slammed her palm onto a specific sequence of runes on the floor. A pillar of pure white light erupted from the ceiling, intercepting the attack and absorbing it harmlessly. Kale snarled, swinging the staff again and again. Each time, Elara moved, not to attack him, but to activate another defensive ward. She was using the archive's own immune system against the infection he represented. She was a scholar, not a warrior, and her greatest weapon was her understanding of this place. His final, furious blast was aimed directly at the obelisk. Elara saw her chance. She did not block the attack. She redirected it. With a shouted command in the dragon tongue, she triggered a massive, dormant ward directly between Kale and his target. The red energy hit the shimmering barrier and rebounded, lashing back onto the staff itself. The dark metal staff screamed, a sound of tearing reality. The red gem at its head flared once, blindingly bright, and then shattered into 1,000 dull, black shards. The artifact's power vanished, its connection to Kale severed instantly. The stolen energy abandoned him, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping, his body trembling with the sudden void. But the victory was hollow. The chamber began to groan, the walls flickering violently. The rebound had overloaded the archive's delicate balance, the air filled with the sound of cracking crystal and shearing stone. The knowledge of ages was tearing itself apart, destabilized by the violent clash. Elara looked from the broken man at her feet to the dying heart of the archives. She could try to save a handful of tablets, to salvage some fragment for her life's work. But it would be a pittance, and the core truth would be lost forever. The choice was agonizingly clear. Her purpose had never been to possess this knowledge, but to protect it. She ran to the central obelisk, her hands finding the cool, smooth surface. Closing her eyes, she reached out with her mind, not to take, but to give a final command. She activated the fail-safe. The ultimate preservation ritual Lorkalin's ghost had shown her only in warning. A profound silence fell. Then, a wave of blinding white light erupted from the obelisk, washing over the entire chamber. It did not destroy, it encapsulated. Every crystal, every glowing rune, every whisper of ancient power was drawn inward, pulled into the core, and sealed away behind impenetrable layers of time and magic. The light faded, leaving behind a plain, dark stone monolith in a silent, empty room. The archives were safe, but they were gone. The temple gave one final, shuddering groan, its purpose fulfilled, its great secret secured once more. Elara stood alone in the deepening quiet, the weight of her sacrifice settling upon her shoulders like a mantle of stone. The central crystal pulsed with a soft, final light, waiting for her command. This was the fail-safe, the last defense of the dragon priests. To touch it was to make a choice that could never be undone. It would seal every archive, every crystal, every whisper of forbidden knowledge into a dimension beyond any mortal reach. All her work, the risks she had taken, the fragments of lore she had memorized, would be wiped from the temple's memory as if she had never been here. She could still turn away, try to salvage a single tablet, and run with a sliver of this power. But that sliver would be a key, a clue that someone like Kale could use to begin this nightmare all over again. Her own ambition, her family's legacy, it all paled against the terrifying responsibility of this moment. She placed her hand upon the crystal. A wave of absolute silence rolled out from the obelisk, a stillness that consumed sound and light. The glowing runes on the walls flickered and died. The very air seemed to thin as the archives were unmade, not with a bang, but with a sigh, pulled into a vault of timeless nothingness. Then the groaning began. With its heart ripped out, Skuldafn started to die. Great cracks raced across the ceiling, and the floor shuddered violently. Kale, still kneeling in shock, looked up as dust and stone rained down around them. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a hollow recognition of the ruin he had helped cause. Elara stumbled through the falling debris, grabbing his arm. "We have to move now." He was a dead weight, broken in spirit and body, but she would not leave him to be entombed. He had been a fool, but he was a consequence of the very hunger for power she had just sworn to prevent. Hauling him up, she half dragged, half carried him back the way she had come, the path now a gauntlet of collapsing archways and shearing stone. The temple was coming down around them, and the only exit was a memory of a ledge high on a mountain, with a sheer drop below. The world dissolved into a roaring chaos of falling stone and shrieking magic. Elara dragged Kale through the disintegrating corridors of Skuldafn, their path illuminated by the violent flicker of dying wards. He stumbled, his body a testament to his shattered obsession, but his will to live had rekindled. With a desperate gasp, he pointed a trembling hand toward a section of wall that seemed no different from any other. There, he shouted over the cacophony, a conduit for the priests, hidden in the stonework. It was an exit she, in all her careful study, had completely missed. Trusting his last-minute clarity, she slammed her palm against the rune he indicated. A section of the wall slid away, revealing not a doorway, but a sheer vertical shaft with a howling wind rushing up from the darkness below. It was a leap of faith into the mountain's heart. There was no time for hesitation. The ceiling directly above them buckled, massive stone blocks crashing down. With a final shared glance that erased their past conflicts in the face of imminent death, they jumped together into the void. The fall was a terrifying rush of cold air and darkness, ending abruptly in a deep drift of snow on a lower ledge. They tumbled out into the blinding daylight, the impact knocking the wind from them, just as the peak of Skulldafn imploded with a final, ground-shaking roar, sealing its secrets for another age. For a long time, they lay in the snow, gasping, the only sounds their ragged breaths and the settling silence of the mountain. Elara looked at Kale, his face etched with exhaustion and a profound, weary regret. She felt no triumph, only the heavy piece of a burden lifted. She had protected the knowledge, but at the cost of ever possessing it. As the sun warmed their frozen clothes, she turned her gaze from the ruin to the vast, living landscape of Skyrim spread out below them. The world was unchanged, unaware of how close it had come to unraveling. Her family's legacy would not be a trove of forbidden texts, but the simple, enduring fact of a world still turning, its balance preserved. The real archive was not in the temples she had explored, but in the very land she was looking at, and her duty was now to learn from it, not to command it. The silence between them was no longer filled with threat, but with a shared, weary exhaustion. Kale finally broke it, his voice rough from the cold and something deeper. I would be dust in that tomb, if not for you. He looked at his empty hands, the phantom weight of the dark staff gone. I sought to undo a single death, and nearly shattered the world. I was a fool, chasing an echo. Your way was the right one all along. Knowledge is not a tool for rewriting the past, but a light for navigating the future. His admission hung in the thin mountain air, a stark contrast to the obsessed man who had lunged for the crystal. He looked at Elara, his gaze clear for the first time. Let me help you, not to find more power, but to record what you saw. My own research, however flawed, combined with your memories, perhaps we can salvage something pure from all this ruin. Elara studied his face, the lines of fury replaced by those of regret. Trusting him felt like a gamble with the highest stakes. This was the man who had tried to break reality itself. Yet in his eyes, she saw no trace of the feverish hunger that had driven him. She saw only a scholar, humbled and hollowed out, recognizing a truth greater than his own pain. She made her decision. Very well, she said, her voice soft but firm. We document everything, not as a weapon, but as a warning, a guide for the next fool who thinks they can master time. A flicker of profound relief crossed Kale's features, and he nodded, the gesture itself a vow. As they began the slow, careful descent from the mountain, their conversation was no longer a battle of wits, but a collaboration. They spoke of the vision of the burning world, of the dragon, priests as stewards, of the chilling cost of temporal magic. They pieced together fragments, Elara's near photographic memory blending with Kale's understanding of dangerous artifacts. They knew the true archives were sealed forever, but the echo of that knowledge, tempered by their hard-won wisdom, could still serve a purpose. It could become a new kind of legacy, one built not on possession, but on protection, a testament to the fact that some secrets are meant to be remembered, not used. The warmth of the tavern hearth felt alien after the biting cold of the peaks. In the quiet town of Ivarstead, nestled at the base of the throat of the world, Elara and Kale found a fragile peace. They rested, their bodies healing from the physical toll, while the silence between them slowly filled with the careful work of reconstruction. Elara shared carefully chosen fragments of her journey with a few trusted scholars at the local inn, her voice steady as she spoke not of power, but of preservation, of the sacred duty to protect history from those who would misuse it. Yet, whispers travel faster than truth in scholarly circles. When her story reached the ears of the more established mages in nearby Winterhold, skepticism curdled into outright dismissal. How could a scholar of her modest standing have survived such places? They murmured, especially with a known rogue like Kale as her only witness. They accused her of crafting an elaborate fiction to cover a failed expedition, her lack of physical evidence seen as proof of a lie. Elara felt the sting of their doubt, a cold weight in her chest, but she refused to engage in public debates or fiery defenses. She understood that some truths are too vast to be believed all at once. Fighting their accusations would only lend them credibility, turning her hard-won wisdom into just another academic squabble. Instead, she let her calm demeanor and unwavering conviction speak for her. To the surprise of many, a handful of younger researchers and archivists, those weary of the college's political games, were drawn to her quiet resolve. They saw in her not a fabulist, but a different kind of authority, one forged in experience rather than privilege. Her reputation may have been tarnished in the halls of power, but it was being quietly burnished in the hearts of those who truly cared for knowledge. Unshaken by the noise, Elara found a small, sunlit room overlooking the river and began the true work of her life. With Kale providing his own fragmented notes and corroborating details, she started to write. The words flowed not as a boastful chronicle of discovery, but as a sobering testament, a warning etched in ink and parchment for any who would follow a similar path. She was building a new archive, not of spells and rituals, but of consequences, determined to ensure the dragon priest's final lesson would never be forgotten. The scratching of her quill was the only sound in the quiet room, a steady rhythm against the parchment. Elara's work was not a chronicle of triumph, but a careful dissection of failure and near disaster. She wrote of the burning world she had seen in the vision at Skulldafn, describing not the power that caused it, but the hollow eyes of the man who wielded it. She detailed the precise, chilling moment when Kale's desperation had fractured time itself, framing it not as a magical event, but as a moral one. Her focus was relentlessly ethical, painting the dragon priests not as sorcerers to be emulated, but as stewards whose immense responsibility had ultimately been their burden. This was the legacy she chose to preserve, a testament to the cost of knowledge untempered by wisdom. Yet, in the deepest hours of the night, a quiet guilt would settle over her. Had she been a preserver, or merely a destroyer wearing a scholar's robe? The physical archives were gone, their truths locked away beyond any reach. Was her written account, these fragile pages, a worthy substitute for the real, breathing power of those crystals? She grappled with the phantom weight of the choice she had made at the obelisk, wondering if a true scholar would have found another way, any way, to save the artifacts themselves. It was this very struggle that gave her writing its raw, compelling power. She did not hide her doubts. Instead, she wove them into the text, framing them as essential questions for any who would seek dangerous truths. Her warnings were not shouted from a pedestal of certainty, but whispered from the shared ground of hard experience. This authenticity was a beacon. Young mages and historians, disillusioned by the college's often cold and political pursuit of power, began to seek her out. They were drawn to her message of responsibility, finding in her account a new philosophy where historical preservation was an act of protection, not possession. Her manuscript, copied and passed from hand to hand, slowly became the foundational text for an emerging school of thought, one that valued context and consequence over raw, unchecked discovery. And as her influence quietly grew within these new circles, a formal invitation, sealed with the blue wax of the College of Winterhold, finally found its way to her door. The great hall of the College of Winterhold was filled with a silence that felt heavier than any mountain. Elara stood before the assembled masters and apprentices, the scent of old books and ozone thick in the air. She did not speak of the specific rituals she had seen or the precise layout of the temples. Instead, she spoke of the cost. She described the chilling moment in Snowhawk when the archive's curse began to steal her memories, not as a magical trap, but as a metaphor for the fragility of understanding. She recounted the vision of the burning world from Skuldafn, focusing on the profound sorrow of a man who had traded his humanity for a chance to rewrite a single day. Her lecture was a quiet argument for a new kind of scholarship, one where the first question was not what can we learn, but what should we do with this learning? A murmur rippled through the hall. An older master, his robes adorned with sigils of elemental mastery, stood, his voice sharp with skepticism. You speak of responsibility as a cage for curiosity. Are we to become librarians of the forbidden, dusting shelves we are too afraid to open? Is that not the death of true academic pursuit? Elara met his gaze, her own voice calm but unwavering. Knowledge without wisdom is a key without a lock, she replied. It opens every door, including the one that leads to the abyss. I am not advocating for ignorance. I am pleading for context. True knowledge is not just the acquisition of power, but the deep and humbling understanding of its consequences. The debate that followed was tense, a clash between two fundamentally different views of a mage's purpose. Yet, Elara did not argue to win. She argued to persuade, finding common ground in their shared love for discovery while challenging its reckless application. She saw nods among the younger apprentices, their eyes alight with a new, more purposeful fire. The conflict did not break her. It forged her resolve into something stronger and more articulate. By the evening's end, a small group of mages, both young and old, gathered around her. They were tired of the endless pursuit of power for its own sake. They spoke of forming a new circle, a research guild dedicated to the principles Elara had championed, one that would seek lost knowledge with the primary goal of stewardship. Later, alone in the guest quarters, Elara looked out at the star-dusted sky above the sea of ghosts. The solitary scholar who had once stolen a map from the Arcaneum was gone. In her place stood a leader, not by title, but by the weight of lived experience and the quiet conviction of her words. The path ahead was no longer a solitary climb, but a road she would help build for others. A road paved with the hard-won, understanding that the greatest secrets are not those we uncover, but those we choose to protect. The foundation of the Seekers of Balance was not laid in a grand ceremony, but in a shared vow of restraint. Elara's small band of followers secured a modest hall in the shadow of the Blue Palace in Solitude, a place where the sea air seemed to wash away the dust of old dogma. Their charter was simple, yet revolutionary, a single principle etched above the hearth. Knowledge is a trust, not a trophy. Kale surprised everyone, including himself, by becoming one of its most dedicated architects. He did not hide from his past, instead using his deep understanding of dangerous artifacts to design the guild's first and most important course, a sobering seminar on the psychology of obsession. He taught new recruits to recognize the warning signs in themselves, the subtle shift from curiosity to compulsion, guiding them away from the chasm he had nearly fallen into. His redemption was not in forgetting his mistakes, but in making them a vital lesson for others. Opposition, however, was swift and vocal. A rival faction, calling themselves the Unbound Scholars, emerged from the more radical circles of the college. They publicly decried the seekers of balance as cowards and censors, arguing that any restriction on knowledge was a betrayal of the academic spirit. They staged protests outside the guild hall. Their leader, a firebrand mage named Valerius, declaring that fear should never be the compass by which scholars navigate. The conflict was not one of spells, but of ideologies, fought in pamphlets and public debates across the city. Elara met this challenge not with anger, but with an unshakable calm, her quiet authority, a stark contrast to Valerius' theatrical fury. She understood that their fight was for the very soul of scholarship. In response, Elara formalized the guild's core philosophy into a strict code of conduct. Every member, before embarking on any research into restricted topics, was required to submit a prospectus detailing not just their methods, but a thorough analysis of the potential consequences. They had to answer a single, profound question: what is the worst possible outcome if this knowledge were to fall into the wrong hands, and how will you prevent it? This was not meant to stifle discovery, but to instill a habit of foresight, to make ethical consideration as fundamental as the scientific method. The code was a living document, a constant reminder that every seeker carried a responsibility, not just to the past, but to the future. As the seekers of balance held firm against their critics, their reputation for integrity began to spread. Their commitment to responsible stewardship resonated with temples of Mara and Ibella, who saw in their work a safeguard against the kind of arcane catastrophes that littered history. Libraries, tired of having their rarest texts stolen or misused, began to form partnerships with the guild, granting them privileged access in exchange for their vow of protection. The guild's influence grew not through force, but through trust, becoming a quiet, stabilizing force in a land often torn by magical turmoil. With the guild flourishing, Elara's role subtly transformed from a founder into a mentor. She now spent her days in the guild hall's sunlit library, guiding new seekers through their first difficult lessons. She taught them how to listen to the whispers of history without being consumed by them, how to walk the line between understanding and ambition. Her own story, once a source of controversy, had become their most vital textbook. How do you navigate the lure of a truth that demands too high a price? The answer was no longer just in a book or a crystal, but in the steady, watchful presence of those who had learned that some secrets are best kept not for power, but for peace. The scent of old paper and ink was a familiar comfort in the guild library, but Elara found her attention drawn to a different kind of energy. Lyra, a new arrival from Cyrodiil, possessed a brilliant mind that moved faster than her patience. She devoured texts on Dwemer tonal theory with a fervor that reminded Elara of her own days, hunched over the fragmented tablet in the Arcaneum. It was a raw, untempered hunger, and Elara recognized the danger in it. She took the young scholar under her wing, not to clip her wings, but to teach her how to navigate the treacherous currents that came with deep understanding. The first lesson was always the same, a quiet conversation over tea, where Elara spoke not of grand discoveries, but of near catastrophes. She told Lyra about the moment in Snowhawk, when the Archive's curse began to pluck memories from her mind like petals from a flower. A stark lesson in the fragility of the scholar who rushes in. She shared the hollow look in Kale's eyes after Skuldafn fell, a living testament to the cost of obsession. These were not stories of glory, but cautionary tales, and Elara watched Lyra's face carefully, looking for the spark of comprehension that would temper her impulsiveness. The true test came when Lyra's own research, a meticulous cross-referencing of merchant ledgers and forgotten ballads, pinpointed the likely location of a minor Aelid artifact, a focusing crystal rumored to amplify simple light spells. The discovery made Lyra's eyes shine with a triumphant fire, and her first instinct was to immediately plan an expedition to retrieve it. Elara felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. This was the precipice. She could forbid it, invoking her authority as guild master, and crush the young woman's spirit, or she could let her leap and risk watching her fall. Instead, she chose a third path. She approved the mission, but with conditions. Lyra would not go alone. She would be accompanied by 2 senior seekers. Her prospectus had to include a new section, detailing not only how she would secure the artifact, but what she would do if its power proved unstable, and a plan for its safe containment upon return. Lyra chafed at the restrictions, seeing them as unnecessary delays, but she complied. The days they were gone felt longer than the climb up the throat of the world. When Lyra returned, she carried a small, linen-wrapped bundle. In the guild hall, under the watchful eyes of her mentors, she unveiled the crystal. It was beautiful, humming with a soft, internal luminescence. But instead of clutching it to her chest, Lyra immediately placed it inside the lead-line containment box she had brought, sealing it with a practiced efficiency. She then presented her full report, which included a troubling addendum. She described a faint, dissonant vibration she had felt from the crystal, a psychic static that seemed to grate against her own magicka. Her recommendation was not to study its amplifying properties, but to first investigate this potentially corrosive side effect. In that moment, watching Lyra prioritize caution over conquest, Elara felt a profound and quiet fulfillment settle deep within her. The young scholar had not just found an artifact, she had found wisdom. The true legacy of the dragon priests was no longer sealed in a lost temple, but lived in the thoughtful actions of the next generation, a quiet flame passed from one careful hand to another. The wind that swept through the ruins of Snowhawk Temple was colder now, carrying the first sharp breath of winter. Elara stood where the grand entrance had once been, now just a tumble of snow-dusted stone. This was where the map had led her, where her solitary obsession had nearly ended in a tomb of ice and curses. The silence here felt different, no longer threatening but contemplative, like the quiet of a library after a great lesson has been learned. She could almost feel the echoes of her past self, a desperate scholar clutching a stolen map, and the spectral weight of Urag's warning in the air. Every cracked pillar and fallen archway was a chapter in her own story, a testament to how far she had come. She realized then that these places were not just locations of power, but teachers. The relentless logic of Snowhawk's traps had taught her precision. The fractured reality of Forelhost had taught her consequence. Even the spectral guardian of Skulldafn, with its probing questions, had been a harsh but necessary instructor. The spirits and ruins had not merely tested her, they had sculpted her, forging the solitary scholar into a leader who understood that true strength lies not in what you take, but in what you choose to protect. This connection to the past was no longer a burden, but a deep, resonant part of her identity. Yet, with this understanding came a familiar solitude. Leading the guild, mentoring seekers like Elara, it was fulfilling work, but it was also a lonely responsibility. The weight of the knowledge she carried, the memories of visions and near catastrophes, were hers alone to bear. No guild charter or code of conduct could truly share that intimate burden. She felt the tension between her public role as a guide and her private self, the woman who had stared into the heart of a temporal storm and made a choice that still haunted her quiet moments. How does one lead others through a garden they themselves are forbidden from ever entering again? Standing there amidst the ruins, the answer came to her not as a dramatic revelation, but as a simple, quiet decision. She would continue her work with the guild, for its purpose was more vital than ever, but she would also carve out a new space for herself, time for personal study disconnected from any grand quest, for reflection that was not a lesson plan. She would walk the forests of Falkreath, simply to listen to the trees, or spend an afternoon in the Solitude archives, researching nothing more consequential than old herbology texts. This balance was not a retreat from her duty, but a renewal of the very spirit that made that duty possible. Her long-term effectiveness, her very ability to be the steady anchor her guild needed, depended on this equilibrium. A leader burned out by the weight of their own knowledge is no leader at all, but just another cautionary tale waiting to be written. By honoring her own need for peace, she was ensuring that the flame of the seekers of balance would not flicker and die, but burn with a steady, enduring light. As she turned her back on the ruins of Snowhawk for the final time, a profound sense of peace settled over her, as tangible as the warmth of a sunbeam breaking through the mountain clouds. The path ahead was unwritten, but she was ready to walk it. The air in the Sanctum shimmered, not with magic, but with the weight of countless ages. Before Elara could even form a thought, the chamber dissolved around her, and she found herself standing in a vast, star-dusted emptiness. All around her, the masked forms of the dragon priests stood in a silent circle, their presence not as individual spirits, but as a single ancient consciousness. Their judgment was not spoken in words, but flowed directly into her mind, a tidal wave of memory and intent. They showed her the full, terrifying scope of the power she had just sealed away, the rituals that could command mountains to bow and seas to part. The temptation was a physical ache, a siren song promising she could reshape the world, ensure peace through unassailable strength, and make her legacy an eternal one. She saw herself as an empress of knowledge, her word absolute, her enemies dust. It was everything a scholar could dream of, and it was a trap more subtle than any she had yet faced. Her answer formed not from ambition, but from the weary, hard-won truth she had carried from every temple. I will not build my legacy on a throne of commanded stone, she thought, her mental voice clear and steady against the psychic pressure. A world forced into peace is not a world in balance, but a cage. True wisdom is not in commanding the river, but in learning its currents and teaching others to navigate them. The collective consciousness pressed harder, presenting a scenario of a plague ravaging a city, a disaster only the archive's most forbidden alchemy could halt. Would she let thousands die to uphold her principles? The ethical snare was exquisitely crafted. She would share the cure, Elara responded, but not the formula for the weapon that could be made from its components. She would guide healers to the solution without handing them the power to create a new scourge. The true purpose of this knowledge is not to solve every problem for humanity, but to give them the tools to solve it themselves, with understanding and compassion as their guides. A profound silence fell within the star-dusted void. The stern, masked faces of the priests did not change, but the pressure in her mind shifted from judgment to acceptance, and then to something akin to approval. The vision collapsed, and she was back in the plain stone chamber, the dark obelisk now warm beneath her fingertips. A final, pure strand of light, like liquid starlight, detached from the monolith and flowed into her forehead. It was not a download of spells or data. It was a key, a permanent, living connection to the archive's core principles of stewardship and equilibrium. She could now access this foundational wisdom in moments of doubt or crisis, a compass for her soul when the path grew dark, but the specific, dangerous rituals remained forever locked away, impossible for her or anyone else to ever retrieve. The power she had been granted was the ultimate restraint, and in that paradox, she finally understood the dragon priest's true, sacred purpose. The northern stars burned like chips of ice in the endless dark above Winterhold. Elara leaned against the cold stone of the balcony, the familiar scent of salt and ancient magic sharp in the air. Below, the sea of ghosts whispered its eternal secrets, but her gaze was turned inward, toward the quiet triumph settling in her soul. The physical archives were gone, sealed in tombs of stone and time, but their true purpose had never been about possession. It was about understanding, a lesson etched not on crystal, but directly onto the fabric of her being. She had gone into the depths, seeking to restore a legacy defined by scrolls and reputation, and she had emerged with something far more profound, a legacy of living principles. The real treasure was not what she had found, but what she had chosen to protect, and more importantly, what she had chosen to become. The wind pulled at her robes, a constant, murmuring presence that no longer felt like a warning, but like an old companion. She thought of Lyra, carefully sealing away the Aelid crystal, of Kale, teaching new seekers to recognize the first flicker of obsession in their own hearts. She thought of the charter hanging in the Solitude Guild Hall, a simple sentence that had become a shield for the future. These were the true inheritors of the dragon priest's secret, not keepers of forbidden power, but guardians of a sacred balance. They were the living scrolls upon which the most vital knowledge was now written, a new kind of archive, built not of stone, but of conscience and choice. The great silence of the lost temples was no longer a void, but a promise kept. Their deepest secrets were safe, not because they were hidden, but because they had been transformed into a wisdom that could be shared without fear, a light that illuminated paths without burning the world. And as Elara watched the constellations wheel slowly over the sleeping land, she knew with a certainty that reached deeper than any academic proof that this was how knowledge truly became eternal, not by being locked away, but by being woven into the very heart of those who came after.